Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Stalingrad, or more specifically, Red Factories. I'm trying to remember if that boxcars I just rolled was for weather. I believe it was. We'll have to see in a short amount of time. Now, I guess I should mention, I'm not sure if I've spoken about it before, but oh, that's why I was putting the sniper just for direction. So whenever you have boxcars, basically what happens is you get gusts. Now, in the game, this can be very, very important. I actually had I played a game recently against a local friend of mine, and we kind of at some point it was very important to determine whether or not there was actually wind or a breeze in the map, because these sort of things again play small parts individually, but in the grand scheme of things can affect really like the entire scenario as a whole. So anyways, let's get back to gusts themselves. If I look at the rules, the basic gist of it is that you determine where the wind is. If there's no wind, you roll randomly. I think that's why I had the sniper rolled a 2. If you look at the sniper counter, a 2 is the northeast hex, or northeast direction. So gusts again affect your smoke placement. They affect the strength of smoke, I believe, because the smoke that gets pushed away shouldn't be as strong as the original ones. I think it also kills light smoke that infantry can place, as well as also affecting fires. Now, we haven't seen flame or fire yet, other than the one burning vehicle I have. So, unfortunately, there's just not much that can happen from that vehicle. It's just too far away from anything. However, having lots of fires going on and then a gust happening can effectively torch a large portion of the map, which isn't always that great depending on how you look at things. We've already seen, or I've already explained, I'm pretty sure, about how if a stone location has burns or is destroyed in some way, that it rubbles it, upper levels get destroyed, of course, and it also means that you're reducing the overall number of locations that can be captured. In the short run, that can be kind of bad, because if you're playing as the Germans, you obviously want to capture more territory, and if you're burning stuff that is close to your units, or reducing rebel locations, I should specify, if you're reducing those locations, you obviously have less to work with, so it makes it harder to advance to further locations, because by nature of movement, you're taking more shots and so on. But on top of that, you also have the long-term effects where, because there are less locations to capture, it means that you're effectively that much closer to winning if you happen to constantly be on the offensive as the Germans. I seem to be getting a number of bad rolls as the Germans right now, but we'll hopefully be able to move past this. When looking at the gust rules specifically, I'll just read this section out so that people get a really good idea as to what gusts do. So, a wind change dice roll, which is what we did, of 12 results in wind gusts, which have no effect on wind force, different thing entirely, but for that player turn only, it allows all terrain blazes to automatically spread to burnable terrain. So if there was a lot more woods The orchards that we see on the right side of the map, those could be affected, so on and so forth. So it automatically spreads to burnable terrain in the direction of the wind. Roll for direction if no wind. In addition, at least one terrain blaze currently in effect will spread 2 hexes during that player turn if possible. Determine the blazes that will spread 2 hexes by random selection from among those with non-burning burnable terrain within 2 hexes of the blaze in the direction of the wind. So it's a very complicated way of saying that you determine at random which blaze you want to be affected, and it has to be it states with those within 2 hexes of a non-burnable terrain, non-burning burnable terrain. So sadly, the vehicle had up top, because the wind was pushing in a different direction, it wouldn't spread. Additionally, any flame that spreads 2 hexes by a gust appears at ground level in its new hex, which makes sense. How could fire spread vertically without going horizontally first? A wreck blaze automatically spreads only to its own burnable terrain location and is eligible for only a possible 1 hex spread instead of a 2 hex spread. A gust eliminates all dispersed smoke and disperses all non-dispersed smoke currently on the board. So I didn't place the rate counter. It should be a +2 instead of a +3 in P0, but because it's not really going to affect anybody except one potential hex, we can get away with not putting a simple +2 there. But what it does mean is that if the Germans are trying to put smoke down and it's not a full strength smoke, it's just going to disperse. So you can't, or at least it'll disperse immediately after in the advanced fire phase, because the rally phase is also when that occurs. But again, the point is that you are going to have a lower strength value for your smoke, which isn't so great on attack. It's better to be on the receiving end of that when you're on defense, because when you're taking shots, it's going to be slightly harder, but not as hard as the +3. And additionally, if the attacker is still moving, you still have the effects of the added cost of entering a smoke terrain. Now, if there was more smoke on the map, this would be a much bigger deal, because I would effectively be dealing with so many different smoke locations that would spread. Because, again, when you're cutting line of sight, or at least when you're affecting line of sight with smoke, it becomes really advantageous to start being able to move, just because of the whole hindrances and all the pluses involved in attacks. Additionally, something to keep in mind is that a smoke counter occupies the entire hex. So if any line of sight is drawn into, out of, or across that smoke, you're automatically taking that +2 or +3. And +4 in some instances, but I don't think we'll ever see it in this campaign. It's for white phosphorus, but again, I don't think we'll ever see it. So another thing that comes into play when we have gusts is collapse. So a building location or locations determined by random selection in which a blaze exists. So unfortunately, this isn't the case here, but presume for a moment that T3, which is a wood building, it's right next to my eastern sniper counter. Presume that building had a blaze in it. If it was determined by random selection to choose that one, or if it was the only one, it'd be the only one applicable. It automatically collapses into burning rubble. So, if you happen to have a blaze that starts out by happenstance, and then it collapses, well, one, you won't have many units in there anyways, but For the sake of argument, it's definitely a bad time, especially when we've already seen rubble in a lot of different locations. And while rubble can be interesting for the purposes of killing line of sight to certain locations, it does mean that on a defender's point of view or attacker's point of view, that becomes a dead zone for line of sight. And again, as with all things in Advanced Squad Leader, changes the dynamic of how you're going to play out your scenario. Speaking about changing the dynamic of the scenario, the Russians are getting the short end of the stick here, it seems. A couple good shots from the Germans, breaking at least 2 squads, and some additional fires that, well, I don't know if I'll be able to successfully eliminate that leader, but it's always worth a try. Now, I still need to make a lot of headway. I believe I'm, at this point in time, I'm getting closer to my objective, but I still only have about 7 or so stone locations. I know I have one in C11, I have the fortified building in F8, the 4 locations in F5 and F6, so that's 6 right there, and a stone location thanks to G7 with the 467 squad in there. So I'm roughly halfway, but I still need to make a lot of headway. So there's a couple units that won't be shooting that basically are going to be for the purposes of movement, or at least hopefully for the purposes of movement, providing the Russians don't get a few good shots on me as well. I've also noticed that I don't believe I've used my artillery again. So, oops. If I haven't mentioned it before, I believe I've been playing artillery a little wrong as well. There's some rules with regards to movement into hexes that are being shot at by artillery. But I believe the way that it affects it is going to be mostly via my own guys moving into artillery, which won't be the case at the moment. But if it does come up, obviously it will have its own series of modifiers and effects. Here's to give you guys an idea. So, rule, I believe this is C1.51, entering an FFV is basically the fire for effect, what happens when artillery is actually going down. It says it also attacks each unit stack that enters a hex in the blast area during the movement phase, rout phase, advanced phase, and close combat phase, which is very important because you can obviously advance into a hex where a close combat is occurring. But I'm not entirely sure why it specifies CC phase. I believe it's because you can withdraw units, so you can retreat from a close combat. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned that before. I don't think that's going to come into play in any of the following videos. However, it is something that the astute player can take advantage of. Actually, I think I may have done it once before. Anyways, point is that the rule states that it also attacks each unit stack that is changing position or becoming vulnerable within a blast area hex if the unit stack is becoming more vulnerable to the FFE than it was in its immediately previous position. So, for example, it's illegal to do this move specifically. So, actually, you know what? Better idea. I'll just use the reverse. So I was going to say that if you had a unit in a fortified location on the second floor going down into a non-fortified location, that's not possible. You have to fortify both levels to do so. But if you had a fortified ground level and the second floor of a building was not fortified, moving from the bottom floor into the upper floor, you would effectively take an attack, because the fact that the fortified location is a +4 versus or a +3 in the case of a wooden building, and going up onto the second floor would be a reduction of 1 terrain effect modifier because of that. So, examples given for that are a unit exiting a sewer or foxhole. We've got plenty of sewers, but sadly none of them have really come into play yet. I just don't have high unit density to be able to move around. There's also not much movement that can really be done up north via sewer movement. A lot of it opens up into streets, and the Germans seem to have quite a few good angles already on those. Claiming wall advantage. Wall advantage is something I've read up on recently. It's not a confusing topic, but it's something that happens automatically and can be sometimes just tough to remember among all the other things. So this was pretty lucky, to say the least. If you shoot into a melee, technically if you shoot into a hex with any unit, if you're shooting into a hex with a moving unit, it's understood that you're shooting the moving unit rather than the one that's not moving. But if you're shooting into a hex that has just everybody is quote-unquote stationary, or everybody is moving, you affect the entire stack. So I had a really good roll there. The modifiers only made it so that the German squad, which just had a higher morale than everybody else, had a really good roll, and next thing you know, they're only pinned. And I've got a sizable advantage, because now those two guys are broken, which means that they offer very little in terms of retaliation when it's going to come to the close combat phase. So not to say that I have guaranteed 2 squad kills, but it's definitely going to be a lot easier for that squad to not only eliminate 1 or more squads, but survive any sort of retaliation. I should probably point out that if memory serves me correctly, a unit that is in close combat, especially like a melee, anything like that, and is broken, does not attack. They can defend at full value, but they don't attack. So definitely going to be a bonus there for my units, or for the German units, I should say. I know I've sung its praises a few times already, but I really enjoy the fact that Vassal gives me the freedom of just applying and looking at units super quickly and all that. Again, going back to the mention earlier, I played a game recently with like I said, a local friend, and boy howdy, I got trounced twice. Thankfully, there are no gliders in this scenario, is all I can say. The glider scenarios are tough, or at least I got really unlucky on my second attempt. There's a lot of rules that are specific to gliders and paratroop landing, and if you don't get good rolls in real life, like I tend to do, which is why I'm thankful that I can at least blame the computer if rolls go poorly. I technically, or not technically, I usually don't get any real good rolls, especially during morale checks. So let's just say that when you lose 50% of your attacking force, or near 50%, on turn one in a glider scenario, you're not really going to go too far, kids. But like I said, I don't believe we're ever going to see gliders. I'm thinking about if there will ever be air supply drops, as that's more that's not really going to apply for a Stalingrad scenario, other than if it occurs further west and southwest, technically, to this current location, because you'd have to have the airfield nearby, and generally speaking, there was no attempt to ever airdrop supplies into Stalingrad, just because, well, I mean, imagine looking at this place from the sky, fires burning everywhere, a lot of destruction, hard to tell where anything really is. Yeah, just tough all around. Which actually reminds me, I was reading a book on the attack on Stalingrad. I don't believe it was the Atlas that I referred to in one of the first videos. I believe it was a magazine, but I can look at it right now. But it's across the room. Anyways, point is that they were making some interesting. I'm losing my words here. There were some interesting aspects of the attack on Stalingrad, namely the fact that the Germans had taken to bombing the city a lot before the major combats like we're currently seeing, or at least representing right now in the Red Factories campaign. A lot of Stukas, HE-111s, and I guess technically also some 109 fighter bombers, just dropping munitions on the city. That's how you have some of these factories being burnt out, and generally all the rubble all over the place. The thing that makes that a horrible decision, if you've never thought that, or if you've always thought that urban warfare is great, you're basically creating cover everywhere, which just makes everything that much deadlier, because you have to get in. And we're going to see, well, we've seen time and time again already, that there's a lot of close combat happening, but that will only get worse and worse and worse as the campaign drags on. But to be, I guess, more direct to it, it was interesting how it's pointed out that the bombing and shelling and whatnot was all-encompassing. Sometimes it would take place in certain areas specifically of the city, but oftentimes it was also just a general destruction or general demolition of the city at large. The fact that you turn entire blocks and avenues into just rubbled terrain makes it especially hard for the Luftwaffe, in this case anyways, to be able to provide any sort of support, because, well, imagine seeing any city from 4,000 or 3,000 meters above ground and trying to dive bomb or even just level bomb in any sort of accurate sense. The fact that the front line changes ever so swiftly and dynamically over the entire city just made it an unreal prospect to ever be able to call any sort of truly accurate attacks. There's obviously exceptions to that. As we can see on this map, north of the barricade factory, at least doesn't have the factory positions, so it's a little easier to determine those really big locations, but otherwise tough all around just to try and get any sort of air support aid. Excuse me. Another thing that was interesting in the article that I read, and I never really considered myself, was the fact that Your Stukas and your HE-111s, while they can drop a sizable amount of firepower. Stukas could carry up to, I believe, 2,000 kilograms of bombs. Actually, I forget if it was 1 or 2,000. Anyways, point is that a Stuka could carry that much, but obviously it's usually in a one bomb configuration. It takes a heck of a long time to ever climb to any decent amount of height. An HE-111 could do larger bomb loads, but again, it's struggling with level bombing, which is never quite as accurate as dive bombing, and it has the same sort of issues with just finding targets and so on. The whole point of this being that there was always the availability of super heavy artillery, as seen with earlier attacks on Sevastopol. And I believe with the earlier attack on, I forget if it was Low or Lodz, specifically. I'm butchering the pronunciation, I'm sure. But the Germans did have super heavy artillery in the 360 millimeter, 420 millimeter categories. It's important that the historical nature apparently dictated that those would be sent off to siege Leningrad rather than Stalingrad. There was some miscommunication, and I believe the belief was that the Germans would be able to take Stalingrad without too much trouble, whereas Leningrad at the time was already sieged and had been so for at least a small amount of time, longer than Stalingrad anyways. And so the idea was that they would send the artillery there to continue the siege, but the Germans never really had enough men up north to be able to completely surround the city and assault it. And the important part is to also assault it. Stalingrad, they were able to at least surround it from the northwest and south sides, but also had the men and material to attempt to capture it. Now, why this is important to note is that had the artillery been used on Stalingrad, one, it's a lot more accurate than your air support, and, well, to be frank, a 320 millimeter or 360, 420, and I believe there might have been a 520, I forget. These super heavy artillery pieces just have so much more firepower in comparison to your 1,000-pound bomb, or in other instances when the Stukas would bring in 500 kilogram bombs, and your HE-111's doing the same thing. The super heavy artillery just had that much more power to it. So whereas your 500 kilogram bomb might destroy the top level of a building, cave in the roof on a factory, so on and so forth, the idea proposed of keeping the artillery on Stalingrad or at Stalingrad and shooting at it was that those super heavy shells would demolish buildings entirely. So instead of creating having a hard time, say, reducing Pavlov's house, you would wipe it out entirely because of it having that much more firepower involved. Now, how true to life is that, and would it have actually been super effective, and so on? Hard to really say, because obviously this is all in the realm of suppositions and guesswork. But it is an interesting point that I don't usually see being made. It's usually the idea that they shouldn't have shelled Stalingrad because, again, ruining the buildings and creating all that rubble everywhere just made it that much harder to ever get around. Although, truth be told, Stalingrad has a lot of buildings and a lot of avenues to it, a lot of factories and construction, and sure, you probably would have reduced it a little bit, but never in the sense that you would have truly affected how the combat and the campaign itself played out. But enough history for a little bit anyways. Getting back to our scenario, I'm starting to actually put in residual firepower, which is always important. And honestly, the more you play this game, the more you should make a serious point at putting down residual firepower. In a lot of cases, it might not seem too important, but I think one of the points I got across, or tried to get across to my opponent in my last real game, was that in our scenario there was a bunch of perimeter wire. Don't worry about it specifically. Basically, imagine the wall we see on the upper middle portion of the map. Imagine if you could not get across that unless you blew holes into the wire. Now, why this is important is because you can only cross perimeter wire through those breaches in them. So, by virtue of that, it becomes really important to deny access to those very few accesses to entry points. So, the idea that I saw that my opponent, I don't believe, ever took advantage of, and I pointed out to him that he should have probably taken a shot with a. He had a for don't take this like too literally, but there was a guy with a machine gun that was close to one of the entry points that my guys were going through, and he had a bunch of guys further away that were also taking pot shots. I had pointed out that he probably should have made an attempt to put some residual firepower on that entry point. It might not have amounted to a lot, but at the end of the day, one of the things that makes residual firepower that much more impressive is that it doesn't take into account certain aspects. Your 2 firepower there is always going to be a 2 firepower, and it receives modifiers on such things like non-assault movement and open ground. So even though it's 2 firepower, even 1 firepower might not seem like a lot, but if your opponent is due for some low rolls, or if your opponent in this example is who's moving through these residual firepower locations is due for some poor attacks, you're in for some trouble. Again, it might not seem like a lot, but when you're starting to lose units just because they're moving through a slightly dangerous location, it's pretty bad. You might think, well, I've survived 1 shot, and then any subsequent movement just ends up being very, very, very dangerous for you. Now, at this point, I'm really desperate to try and open up the southwestern avenue, so to speak. The main reason I want and absolutely need to do this is because there's not much on this left flank. And if I can break this one location, I can manage to take a very nice stone building that has at least 6 locations to it, 6 stone locations to it. So if I were to capture that, I practically don't have to move anymore with the Germans. And I can just focus on reducing certain units and taking a much more careful path, because at that point I only need 2 more locations, 2 or 3 depending on how I've counted them, and I'm golden. I don't need to worry about much anymore. So one thing that I for whatever reason I'd forgotten about, a unit that is CX adds a +1 to their IFT dice rolls. I don't know why I somehow forgot that. Thankfully, my opponent this past weekend reminded me of that limitation. So I'm not sure why it's not just a I feel like the CX counter could have probably been written differently to mention that, because I don't know, it adds a +1 to a lot of tasks or things that a squad would do normally. So keep that in mind. So the final protective fire, which this is, becomes very important because a final protective fire uh, affects the shooting squad as well as whatever it is shooting at, obviously. So a final protective fire, the idea is that your units have already shot twice, and you're starting to get very, very desperate, and you absolutely don't want to get overrun by anybody. Now, what happens is the final protective fire, that number, whatever is rolled, applies to all units that would be affected by the shot, as well as the shooter. So in this case, a 6 applies directly to the morale of that unit. So you would determine 6 fire, whatever the firepower amount is. In this instance, because it's halved and then doubled, we're looking at just a straight 6 on 6 firepower shot, I believe, which is a 1 morale check. The 6, on the other hand, applies to the morale check, or counts as the morale check roll for the Russian squad. So the German squad will have to roll a 1 morale check, and the Russian squad applies the 6 to its own morale, which is 6. And I believe I might be checking to see if the pin result will actually modify it, but that wouldn't make sense because, well, you're already calculating the damage, so you wouldn't get pinned and then calculate damage. I might be checking for the leader, however, and if that modifies the roll at all. Another thing to keep in mind is that while it was, I believe, a 1 morale check, it is also there's some modifiers due to just like running around, getting in the building, and so on. Because my German leader failed his morale check at such a high by such a high amount, he gets replaced as a worse leader. The joys of ELR being readily apparent there. Now, if you're wondering why the Russian squad didn't actually pin or break, it is specifically because in the rule set it says immediately after normally resolving the final protective fire attack versus the moving units, which was the German leader there, the fire's original IFT dice roll, which was 6, is modified only by any applicable leadership DRM and is used as a normal round check against the firing units using final protective fire, including any directing leader. Whenever a casualty MC or heat of battle, etc., goes on to say some other things. But the basic idea, basic gist of it is that yes, the squad did come under effect of a normal morale check, but thanks to the leader that was stacked with them offering that -1, they were fine for the moment. And unfortunately, it seems that another German squad goes down due to a very nice roll on the part of the Russians. Again, the fact that there's residual firepower around means that I'm losing certain avenues of approach. I would have really liked to be able to go from F4 to G5 to H4 and then I5, and then potentially either going into the stone rubble in, I believe that's J5, or going into the fortified building location at I6. And sadly, the machine gun there rolled too high, so it doesn't keep its rate of fire. And now they have, the Russians have even more to worry about. If I'm able to move that medium machine gun into the stone rubble location, I've got at least a 3 potential shots on anybody south of them. Being able to shoot anybody to the immediate east of him is going to be rather nice. Among other things, to be certain. Now, of course, the main reason why I'm doing this at all is because while I have some broken units up north, I really want to rescue the guys in that series of F buildings. They're not as good, I believe. At least I can see the 1/2 squad with the 6 morale. It's not so great. While there is a unit, another half squad where he was initially, or where that leader was initially, I'm really trying to push for this F row of buildings, especially now that I've lost even more guys or had even more men break all the way south in that southwestern position. And again, I'm feeling a lot more pressure here to actually do stuff as the Germans. It might seem kind of strange for that to be the case, but I still don't have all the stone structures I need, and the Russians have one more free turn. Well, I say free turn, but they have one more turn to be able to do stuff. And if I don't hit that 15 stone structure locations, and the Russian side rolls the 3, then the scenario ends, and well, the Germans just won't be the victors. So the 4 turns that you start with, you can kind of do whatever you want, but if you're not making progress on by at least that 5th turn, then you might as well just count it as a loss, anyways. Obviously, if you're really close to capturing 15 separate locations all in one go, then, who am I to tell you you're doing a bad job? But at this point in time, as the German side, I really need to start establishing myself on the map with regards to those 15 important objective locations. Although, at this point, I keep saying 15, and I'm wondering if that's actually supposed to be 14 instead. Let's see what... No, it is 15. Good. This is pretty much the result I didn't want. Um, I kind of sometimes prefer having a unit break versus a unit pinning, because when they're pinned, sure, they're functional, but they're still not able to really do anything. While I want that guy in a stone structure location or stone location, and being pinned does nothing for him. On top of that, because he's pinned in the road, well, he's kind of a sitting duck that way. I sometimes wonder if that 3 hex fire group that I made was the right call. Looking back on it, I think almost immediately after I'd taken the shot, I kind of wish that I'd had just the two, either the one building or the 2 buildings rather than the 3 hexes, just for the leader bonus and advantageous rolls that would have brought with it. And we can kind of see here a little bit of desperation. I really need to get some shots down, and I need to get the ball rolling as the Germans. This is pressuring me to move my guys even more, and more so than I probably would prefer. And because of that, well, we can already see that there's a couple losses that are being taken due to that. And get another shot against that fortified location that sadly just won't be able to do too much. It is halved and then doubled if I'm actually shooting that fortified location. Assault fire means that you're having you do the double for point blank, then you half it for being advanced fire. In this case, it'd be 10 down to 5, and then you add 1 for assault fire. And then you also round up fractions if it's the case. So it doesn't apply for your 10 firepower guy, but it does mean that instead of going down to 4 firepower, which is what you would expect in this sort of instance, it goes up to 6, which is actually pretty nice. The other squad with him provides the 2, so you're up to 8.5. Well, 8, and then 9.5 thanks to the LMG. But 9.5 doesn't get you anything, so stick to the 8 and don't use the machine gun. If it's point blank fire, actually the 4 firepower guy goes back up to 4, obviously. And the same thing with the LMG. It goes to 1.5 and then doubles for being adjacent. So in the end, that'd be a 12 firepower shot. Again, very strong firepower that can be brought, but you have to be the real trick to it is you have to be adjacent, which is tough to do, or tough to survive anyways. Some of these shots aren't so great either, but really sometimes desperate measures or desperate times call for desperate measures, and it's sometimes just better off to attempt these things. This is pretty risky as well. I didn't get a good shot, of course, which is more or less just thankful that that's not the case. This also was a shot that wasn't really going to go anywhere, mostly for the fact that a unit that advancing fires halves their attack, and then if they're pinned on top of that, you have it again. So, instead of if he had 4, it's now down to 1 firepower. It's obviously not a lot. And now that all the shots are made and all of the units have moved, it's time to route once again. There's quite a number of units on the German side that will be forced to route, and we can only hope that they'll be successful in doing that for the next turns. But the Russians also have their own units that are better off attempted to preserve for the at least the short term. Again, that fortified location is kind of a death trap because getting out of it is impossible with where the Germans are set up. It's actually one of the main reasons why I wanted a unit on the road, because it prevents the Russian unit from going northeast. Although I'd have to check the line of sight just to make sure that the rubble doesn't block the view. If the rubble did, then yeah, you could move northeast provided there was no German unit there. Although I think they would have line of sight, but anyways. It's pretty telling that I've still got units that are trying to go from the right side of the map to the left. Obviously, some of these should be taken into account that they were either done later, but just the amount of rubble everywhere really diminishes the Russian players or any player's ability really to go anywhere. I don't know why I'm not doing this as the Germans first. I think this is the issue I'm having with just playing everybody at the same time. The German player really should be going first, regardless. The attacker obviously always goes first. Thankfully, the leader passed that morale check, or else he was probably going to be eliminated, and the DC charge with him would either be eliminated or get dropped, whichever. I've learned my lesson, and those guys are going to go into a building to hopefully survive any future attacks, or any future rally attempts, I should say. Make it easier on them. Obviously, looking back on it, I don't believe that building was the optimal choice, just because there is that 527 that can still look at them. The guys should really have run over to A9, I believe. And with routes over, I get to now have my guys go back into this fortified location. Thankfully, the Russians just don't have anything near or inside of it. Again, because trenches are connected to stone locations, even if they're rubble, it's definitely something to take advantage of with regards to advancing. Trenches still offer a very nice bonus to attacks, especially off-board artillery or air support, I believe. And regardless of which one attacks them, being able to advance immediately into the trench, take advantage of that position, and then have the connection to go into the fortified location if you so choose, really makes it a good position to take. I have a bit of a dilemma in this location, just because I want to keep an entire line of units in case I ever want to do like a massive attack with a fire group, but I also don't want to expose that 8-1 leader to anything, because, well, I've already got like 2 leaders that are injured and suffering some pretty bad effects, and honestly, leaders will be probably one of the deciding factors in this entire campaign. You only ever get a limited amount. You can generate heroes, but not leaders, or at least I don't. Well, actually, you know what? I think you can. Anyways, point is that you always have a limited number of leaders. This goes double for the Russians, and losing that bonus, that benefit, being able to rally people or more people at a time, the direction modifiers, all that stuff that applies to leaders is just too good to pass up and not and miss, because it just becomes a sort of compound or cascading effect. Now, technically, these 2 guys have to fight. Or actually, you know what? One can technically withdraw, because withdrawal does not count for the purposes of route, and because it's not the route phase, if you withdraw into an adjacent hex, even though there's a unit that's still adjacent to them, it's still an okay thing to do, I believe. But you know what? It's always nice to check rules when you have the rule book next to you. Alright, so there are, again, 2 Russian units there. There's at least 1 German unit. I believe I advanced a German unit in there as well. So, withdrawal from melee, which is currently what's going on. Any infantry unit engaged in melee, which is not currently pinned, which the Russians are not, may attempt to withdraw from melee. There's an exception for Berserker disrupted units, but that's not the case at the moment. Here I'm just re-breaking them just to see what their firepower values are. They're for both. By announcing its intention to do so, the attacker must announce if they're withdrawing, and then the defender does so subsequently. And it has to be done at the start of the CC phase, prior to both sides' declarations of CC attacks in that location. So normally how it goes is you start the CC phase, and then the attacker should be declaring if they're doing any withdrawals. Then if the attacker does not, the defender declares if he's doing any withdrawals. You play out those attacks first, and then you go on with the other CCs. So, in terms of how that applies, withdrawing units may not make any CC attacks and are subject to a -2 DRM to all CC attacks made against them during that CC phase. So, basically, it's a very bad thing to have to withdraw. But sadly, it won't even get to that point because, well, the Germans rolled rather well. Now, there are some conditions for a unit being able to enter close combat concealed and then leave that attack concealed, but we probably won't see it for a little bit, sadly. Anyways, there's a little bit more on withdrawal, but I guess I'll cover it in a later time. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next video.